rocket launching facilities, whose teachers are hired right off the Hamas payroll. Al-Qutla al-Islamiyah, which is Hamas's youth wing, has been caught actually going in to UN schools and recruiting children for suicide-homicide attacks. The Trump administration recently cut funding to UNRWA in an incredible move of moral clarity and judgment. But on the other hand, submitted a brief in the Sokolow case arguing against asserting jurisdiction over the PLO when a court had awarded, I think it was about $600 million worth of damages to terror victims. How do we reconcile this approach?
Well, acknowledge my two very esteemed co-panelists and how hard it must gave Stuart and his wife the Elie Wiesel Award, bestowed by Elie Wiesel's family, his wife Mary and his son Elisha, last year. And we also gave it to Prime Minister Netanyahu posthumously for his brother Yoni Netanyahu, the great Israeli hero. So thank you for sharing this stage with us. We in the pro-Israel community, well, let me at least speak for myself, as a member of the pro-Israel community, we're very grateful to President Trump for the stalwart support of Israel in 4 key areas. Moving the embassy, he mentioned that last night in the State of the Union. Defending Israel at the UN, Nikki Haley did an incredible job. I believe that Heather Nauert, the ambassador designate, will do an equally incredible job. She's already done that as spokesperson at the State Department. Defunding Palestinian terrorist entities. And in general, making it clear to the world that if you want to have a good relationship with the United States, you ought to have a good relationship with Israel. It's a key ally. President Obama spoke about daylight between the two countries, and I think President Trump has closed that daylight. Qatar remains an anomaly. I don't get it. I understand there's a giant base there, and I understand that we need allies in the Gulf. But I also understand the United States probably has a lot of leverage over Qatar. Mm-hmm. And at first, when President Trump went to the Middle East, and he went to Riyadh and Jerusalem, and then he went to Europe, at that time we heard there's going to be pressure put on Qatar to stop funding Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. And that made a lot of sense. It wasn't an attack on Qatar. It was saying, look, you can't fund terrorism and be our ally. And then it kind of all changed, and I don't understand where the change came from. Did it come from lobbying? Did it come, I don't know. It was a very clear message. Now, some people tell me Qatar funds Hamas transactionally. They want to be a key regional player, and it gives them, they punch above their weight, and that's why they also want FIFA. I'm not smart enough to understand a country's motivation. I lack the information. And as a Jew, intention is far less important to me than action. We Jews say, Hamasehu Aikar, it's what you do that's really important. For whatever reason they're doing this, so long as they're funding Hamas to murder Jews, and the United States is a key ally of Israel, it makes no sense. The pressure is not being put to stop this. It's got to stop. And Al Jazeera and everything else, we could talk about that. So look, has the Trump administration been an outstanding ally of Israel? Incredible. This president has been more supportive of Israel than any of his predecessors, period. But Qatar remains an anomaly. And the president spoke very eloquently last night, as does Secretary Pompeo continually, about Iran. And the president ended his State of the Union speech last night focusing on Iran. And he spoke about Iran's barbarity, their violent government, how they're the world's foremost state sponsor of terror. And Qatar is their ally in the Middle East. They don't have to choose to be that ally. Like I said, all the things that we did were to send a simple message. You want a good... Why does Qatar need a PR makeover in the U.S.? Why did they approach Jewish leaders for PR makeover? Because they had a bad reputation supporting terrorism. Well, that's treating the image instead of curing the problem. Stop funding terrorism, and you won't have to spend tens of millions of dollars on lobbyists, and get a terrible name as this stuff starts to come out, let alone corrupting all of those people. Because this is a story of corruption. It's a story of corruption. You won't need to do that if you simply stop funding terrorism. I don't even understand how it's good for the Palestinian people to fund Hamas. I'm no great friend of the Palestinian Authority for reasons that we just discussed. It's on their books to pay terrorists to kill Jews and their families, let alone they murder Palestinians for selling a house. to a Jew. That's officially on their books as well. I can't condone that behavior. But even so, they don't want to see Hamas funded. They know that Israel withdrew every last soldier from Gaza in 2005. There were no Jewish communities there. There's not one Jew. There's a partial naval blockade to stop weapons coming in so that more Jews can't be murdered, rockets fired. But Hamas could have built a thriving Palestinian society. I went to Gaza City with the Reverend Al Sharpton when Yasser Arafat was alive. I saw the squalor, I saw the poverty. And now Hamas, which took over, is the single largest recipient of foreign aid per capita in modern times. And what have they done with it? Build bombs to kill Jews? Don't they care about Palestinian children? And Qatar keeps on funding this and funding this and funding this, and everyone keeps on thinking, it's going to get better. If we pay the Gaza civil servants, it's going to get better. If we give them truckloads of cash, literally, it's going to get better. And it doesn't get any better. Because an ideology which is genocidal in nature, it's not going to get better until they change that ideology. Live in peace with the Jews. We're not your enemy, for God's sake. But I'm not an Israeli citizen. I'm an American citizen. I'm a Jew. I love Israel. I'm an American. I respect Israel's values. But as an American, I look at this and I'm wondering, why doesn't our government put more pressure to simply end this when we can? I'm not even saying that we should not be an ally of Qatar. I'm saying put pressure to end their nefarious activity, including spewing anti-Semitism regularly and anti-Israel vitriol through Al Jazeera. Is that why it exists? I mean, is that why this? Teach people. Tell people the news. Don't give it this editorial slant. Or if it does, don't let it spew into hatred. And certainly don't give sanctuary to violent killers in your country. That we have to debate this stuff and discuss this stuff is shocking.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that this panel or even this event is controversial, the fact that we're talking about Qatar is controversial, I think is a signal that we're a little bit sick right now. And we're so intertwined. So we know what your position is, obviously, on Jewish leaders going to Qatar. But would you ever appear on Al Jazeera knowing, or have you ever appeared knowing the reach that it has with millennials, maybe using it as an opportunity to get your message out there in a network that is normally extremely anti-Semitic, anti-American, and so forth? Where should we draw that line?
Look, we all want to believe that engagement and dialogue is critical to peace. And of course it is. If you don't talk, there's no peace. But there has to be red lines. And the red lines for me are genocide. It was the reason that I opposed the Iran nuclear agreement. Iran, I was telling friends of mine, including Democratic senators who voted for the legislation, that even if you don't vote to support Israel with $3.8 billion in annual military aid, even if you don't vote to fund Iron Dome, you could still be a good friend of Israel. We can debate whether Israel needs the funding. I think right now it does, and it needs American assistance. But that doesn't mean you're anti-Israel if you oppose that. But if you vote to give a government that calls for the annihilation of the Jewish people, $150 billion, that's genocide. Then you're endorsing genocide. You're endorsing genocidal rhetoric. The United States is a signatory to the United Nations anti-genocide legislation that was put through by a Holocaust survivor named Raphael Lemkin, and I think 150 odd nations have signed that. You're not allowed to use genocidal rhetoric. It's a violation of international law. So to answer your question, if governments engage in genocidal rhetoric or support organizations that are genocidal in nature, that's the red line. You cannot, anything you do with them will only be legitimization.
Used, right, and they could take your image and use it other ways. Sari, you talked about justice, and as a victim, how you, as an individual American citizen, can pursue that, and especially your role as a plaintiff on these cases. But it's also the role of Congress and the role of U.S. courts to facilitate justice. With legislation like the Terror Force Act, we also have the Anti-Terrorism Act. And there's been a lot of writing about how the act has been completely gutted. The Anti-Terrorism Act was initially put in place so that Americans could sue in American courts for acts of terrorism that happened abroad. And because of a recent, at least 2 decisions, the victims of terrorism who spend time and money and so much effort using the justice system are now unable to sue the PLO because courts have ruled that there is no personal jurisdiction. So to remedy that, there was the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act, which said a lot of things, but two important things for this panel. Number one, if you have an office here in the United States and you avail yourself of this jurisdiction to conduct business, you have voluntarily acquiesced to personal jurisdiction in U.S. courts. And two, if you receive U.S. aid, you are also agreeing to have personal jurisdiction, which Lawfare blog, funded by the Brookings Institute, funded by Qatar, actually came out against, saying the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act is unconstitutional. Despite the fact that their argument is extremely weak, the problem is that U.S. aid to the PA, the PLO, has been cut, and Trump closed the offices. So seeking justice is never black and white. And so as a plaintiff in a variety of lawsuits, how do you feel about the constant jarring between Congress and the courts and how long it has taken to recover? And once they're recovered, the judgments are then overturned because of the issue of personal jurisdiction. Shouldn't it be that if you kill an American abroad, you should be able to be held accountable in a U.S. court?
So I always feel, and I remember saying this after the attack, that no matter where I am in the world, I always feel like that my country and my government should be protecting me. And I think that it's very difficult to feel protected when those politicians that are supposed to be there for us are helping to stop what we're trying to do, which is to seek justice for what's happened to us. But I think this isn't only a U.S. problem. I mean, this is a global problem of terror financing. As I told you earlier, I've spoken to members of parliament in the UK and talking to them about accountability. You want to help the Palestinians? Please. They need help. But you need to know that the money is going directly to where it needs to go to and not towards funding future terrorist attacks. And I think that sometimes the political leaders don't really understand this, because if it didn't happen to me or my family, it's not really something that's my problem. I have other things to focus on. What people don't realize is that this is not just a global issue, but terrorism is still rampant and it's still out there, and we're all still vulnerable to it. And for me, and I think for many victims, the reason why these lawsuits are so vital to us is because it's our way of seeking justice by stopping the money from getting into the hands of those that can carry out future attacks. And if the money is not there, the attacks cannot happen, because that's the motivation. The motivation for these young people, especially, and Brooke, you've done a documentary on this and talked about young people who've been indoctrinated through terrorism. The motivation for them is the financial gains for their family, because they feel like they have no choice, and they've been brainwashed to believe that this is the ends to the means for them. And I think if we stop that terror financing, if we stop the trail of the money, we can stop terrorism from continuing, and we can start to build more bridges. Because I really believe until the next generation is educated not to hate, this is not going to stop. And we're not doing a very good job of educating when our governments are stopping the legislation that needs to be put in place for us to be able to seek justice through means that are regular venues of the courts. The courts are our way. We're not doing any roundabout. We're not trying to do anything. We're trying to go directly to the source. And the way to do that is through the court system. That was the way I felt it was important to fight back. And in order to do that, we need the government and we need our elected officials to support us completely. And I'm sure Stuart has had the same experience that I had. When you walk into a congressional office and you're meeting with a congressional leader, they definitely feel for your story, but it's the action afterwards that's most important. I always say to them, I don't care if you remember me or my name or my story, but I represent thousands of people, thousands of Americans who've been directly impacted by terrorism. This isn't just about me. This is about them and their families as well. And I really think that it's everybody's responsibility, not just those of us that have been impacted by terrorism, but every single individual in the world that has a place to be able to make a difference to help stop this funding. And so we all have a role in this, not just those of us that have been directly impacted.
You're right. I mean, we were talking obviously a lot today about the acts of terrorism and financial support for acts of terrorism and designated terrorist groups. But there's a whole support system of legitimacy. When Europe, European courts allow, for example, for war crimes charges against Israeli officials and American officials in Belgium, Sweden, Spain, I think Canada as well, and CP Livni and Ariel Sharon can't land in London without fear of an arrest warrant. But the political wings of Hamas and Hezbollah are allowed to cross European borders with total impunity on their financing and fundraising and speaking tours. It sends the message that these are legitimate parties.
Absolutely.
So, Stuart, you had mentioned in the green room and talking about other countries, America is a leader, though we do have our problems when it comes to legislation that will be written to properly affect the provisions that Congress intended in the Anti-Terrorism Act. But you were just in Canada, was it? Or you're speaking to some Canadian officials, and there might be some hope that Canada will enact also anti-terrorism legislation, and that you're involved in that. Is that correct?
There are a lot of activists in different countries that are interested in legislation similar to the Taylor Force Act. And I think that when it was passed into law here, and shortly thereafter in Israel, and the same day in Israel it was also decreed by the Australian government, that it gave legitimacy to other countries to say, hey, we have a leader now. The United States is leading, addressing this problem. And I think any opportunity, everybody in this room knows somebody somewhere in another country to say, hey, this is what we did here. Perhaps you can address the funding. If I can make just one comment. People ask, well, the Taylor Force Act was passed, wasn't it? I said, yes. And they said, but you're still going to D.C. or New York or to Florida to meet or talk. And they said, why are you doing that? And I said, well, because it's passed. And the United States, as of last fall, withheld $167 million that was going to the Palestinians, Hamas. But there are other countries that are stepping in to fill the void until other countries say, hey, you know what the United States has done, perhaps this might dampen their operations, and perhaps they can redirect their efforts to helping their own people. But there's another part of the Taylor Force Act. I have to say this real quick, and I'll be quiet. But there's another part of the Taylor Force Act, other than just stopping the funding, that's really important. Two more other provisions. One says that the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, has to renounce terrorism and rewarding terrorism as a practice. And the other provision in the act is that they have to remove the written laws providing the schedule of pay-for-slave payments. Now, it's good to withhold the money, and it will be withheld until they fulfill the other two provisions. And that's important now. That's what we're focusing on, is to not only stop the money flow, but to get them to say terrorism, pay-for-slave is not the way to conduct a good government. Anyway, that's...
Rabbi, I'm going to end with you. I think we have about a minute and a half left. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, we're here in Washington. If you want everyone to have one action item, a takeaway, when they walk out of this room today, what would you suggest that we do vis-a-vis the influence that Qatar has on American foreign and domestic policy?
Well, firstly, Stuart, I wish you and your wife continued comfort from God and from the American people and the Jewish community.
Thank you.
And your son's memory should be an eternal blessing. And thank you for your sacrifice. It was never wanted. It was forced upon us, but you turned it into a blessing. And may that continue. Secondly, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? I really would turn to my Islamic brothers and sisters, my Arab brothers and sisters, and say, it's time for your countries to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. And this is the administration with which to do it, because this administration has shown tremendous regard for those who are more open to Israel, because Israel is an ally. And Israel is an ally of the Gulf states as well. You're beginning to see that the prosperity, the economic prosperity, the technological innovation, The kind of gifts that Israel brings to the Middle East is a bounty that should be shared by all, and the time has come. And the excuses that such diplomatic relations would lead to the radicalization of certain elements, that radicalization could be found with other sources, I can assure you. But the time has come. The time has come for peace in the Middle East. Even if our Palestinian brothers and sisters don't see it, that doesn't mean that other Arab nations can't. And there's really no excuse anymore. So in all these rumors that we hear that Israel has secret relationships here and secret military cooperation there, it's got to go beyond that. That's the light at the end of the tunnel. Mm-hmm. If countries like Qatar or Iran don't want that to ever happen, because for whatever reason, ideological, transactional, whatever the reason is, they hate Israel and hate the Jews with a deep loathing, and they want to see the Jews disappear from the Middle East or die in some violent way, that's their problem. And let them be isolated as a result of it. Let them be marked with the mark of Cain, that they have an irrational, obsessional hatred with the Jews who have a tiny little sliver of land that they returned to after 2,000 years, but they want to live in peace and harmony. Which leads me finally to a message for the Jewish community, which is, there has never been a proper accounting of what happened in our community with the whitewashing of Qatar. The fact that that has not happened is an insult to the constituent members of our community who were played for fools, because there are people supporting organizations that whitewash Qatar. And when your message to your people and your donors and your fans and your supporters is that you're there to support Israel, and I believe in all my heart in supporting Israel. As a Jew, as an American, as a human being, I believe in supporting Israel. But when that is your message to your constituents and your supporters, and you're whitewashing some of Israel's foremost enemies who are funding the murder of Israelis, then there has to be an accounting. And it's never been done. Rabbis who went to Qatar, Jewish communal activists who went to Qatar, people who wrote articles praising Qatar, people who took millions of dollars from Qatar, people who invited Qatari leaders to family celebrations while Israelis were mourning their children, while rockets were falling on Jewish communities, inviting the leaders who were funding this to family celebrations. For God's sake, have we no decency? No one would believe this story, and no one would believe that there was a whitewash of the whitewash. And I want to tell you, our organization lost a lot of funding from a lot of people that told me, you're just creating divisions in the Jewish community. We don't want to see fights among Jewish leaders. As it is, the pro community is so small, we don't want to see divisions. What's the alternative? To let people whitewash government sponsors of terror? You know that when the Neturei Karta, who hate Israel, they're ultra-Orthodox, as if you can be ultra-Orthodox and, okay, that's another subject. Ultra-Orthodox Jews who hate Israel, they protest against Israel. They went to meet Ahmadinejad in Tehran, and they did a video with Ahmadinejad to Tehran. I told you, my father's family is from Iran. To see what's happened to that poor country under the mullahs, the economic devastation, the human rights abuses. And these guys, these rabbis went and they sat with Ahmadinejad. We were all disgusted. Everyone in the Jewish community saw that video, and we wanted to vomit.
Yeah, that's a good point.
How was this so radically different, sitting with the emir when he's paying and funding Hamas? Because it was done secretly? Is that why?
Perfect point.
Is it because it was done, we were actually there to change him? As if the emir of Qatar was going to stop funding Hamas because Rabbi so-and-so or Jewish communal head so-and-so went and had coffee or tea with him in his palace. Come on. That's not naivete, it's willful naivete.
Rabbi, thank you so much for your passion and for your courageous leadership on this issue in particular, and Sari and Stuart for being so brave and courageous, for sharing your story with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists for their heartwarming stories, their heartfelt testimony, and their call to action. Our next panel will be moderated by Daniel Pipes, the founder and president of the Middle East Forum. He'll be joined by Mohammed Fahmy, Alberto Fernandez, and Samantha